I'd like to start with a blunt statement. Not all ruins are created equal. The goal of my presentation is to analyze this idea and ask why, to offer some thoughts about ruins, our surroundings, and the built environment. I contend we can rethink the future and reimagine it through the ruins of the past, by using the ruins of antiquity, for instance. The perceived inequality of ruins is not only due to the historical prominence of certain structures in what Derek Gregory calls the geographical imagination, but also a result of different attitudes and ideas about space and place. As philosopher S.K. Toombs or urban theorist Edward Soja might tell you, lived space is something we each experience differently. We feel different ways about different places, and we also may feel differently in as well as around them. The human place ballet, to steal a term from David Seaman, has been going on for quite a while, and it involves sentiments, feelings, our bodies, and our minds, which collaborate to create a link between people, place, and time-space. On an individual level, we can each feel drastically different about different places. For example, I feel differently about my grandmother's home than I do a school across town that I've never seen. However, on a collective level, in terms of how we relate to space and place, there is often a cultural, historical, and socio-political premium placed on important sites, while others are ignored, dismissed, or precluded from consideration in broader discussions and spatial narratives. I argue this is evident, qualitatively and quantitatively, not just in terms of housing, access to resources, and public health issues, but in terms of sentiment and reverence and historical and cultural gravity, and in how these are formed and maintained over time. And here's where the ruins of antiquity come into the picture. I always talk about one building in particular when discussing these ideas. I've never seen the Parthenon in person, but I do feel a certain way about it. There's a weight there, and a large part of that weight is the mystique that has accrued over time. And that ruin, if we think of it as a gathered physical reflection of history, labor, existence, and change, exudes an intrigue which is both persistent and pervasive. In the case of a high-value ruin, such as the Parthenon, we see a place people value and protect, as well as curate in its state of decay. This curation has a huge impact on the cultural perception of these sites. Now, on the other side of the fence, outside of Athens, think of a building you've seen in and around your daily life which is falling into disrepair, like an abandoned gas station just sitting there. It's not the Parthenon, but it's also a building which held a role and a function in a community and in a place, one subject to the ravages of time and the degradation that comes along with it. My interest lies in seeing what formations and what ways of thinking about time, space, and place are reflected in our respective attitudes toward the Parthenons and the abandoned gas stations of the world. What's formed our cultural imaginations, plural, with regard to these respective sites? Sure, you can say, Evan, it's just a gas station, but who's to say that in 1,000 years, that gas station won't be the Parthenon of gas stations? I argue antiquity is a great thing to look at when we're thinking about the past, and its histories and its meanings and the struggles which inform how we interpret it. But it's also worth looking at antiquity, and specifically the ruins of antiquity, for clues about how to envision the future. Not all ruins are created equal, sure, but what reinforces those inequalities? By projecting ourselves into the future and considering ruins from that standpoint, we can reconfigure the past as well as the present. Looking at ruination gives us a chance to dive into different interpretations of sites, structures, histories, and configurations of geographical and geophysical memory. I argue, following a number of theorists, historians, architects, anthropologists, artists, and many others, that ruins are an excellent focal point for looking at not only what was, but what is as well as what may come to be. These are not just sites of past glories reminding us of death and doom and gloom. In ruins, temporality need not only be one way. I argue that when we look at the ruin, we see the past's future, but also the future's past. George Simmel discussed buildings falling into ruin as cosmic tragedies, and looked at them to explore connections between then and now, humans and nature. I want to extend this, as I believe reinvestigation and reassessment of the built environment through its ruins is, among other things, an investigation of future potentials and possibilities beyond physical and material decay. When it comes to appreciating structural ruination on a broad cultural scale, time is the secret ingredient. But we have to rethink time for this to really be the case. It's not as simple as saying, this ruin is old and is in this place, and is famous for being old, and is therefore important, or at least more important than this or that other ruin, which is not old and not in this place. That doesn't help us understand the peculiar appeal of a ruin. Time is not without its own different types and variations. People conceive time differently. Architects have been playing on this theme for quite a while. One particular architect, Pritzker Prize winner Arata Isozaki, offers a striking model of what he calls imaginative time, and discusses how it impacts his perception of the built environment in an essay translated into English and made available via the website Puente Arquitectura. In this essay, Isozaki talks about absolute time, time as we commonly perceive it, and contrasts it with imaginative time. Isozaki states imaginative time is the, quote, axis on which we actually live. Time as we inhabit it is thereby colored with special hues, and one of its peculiar features is the freedom with which we can develop it into the past and into the future. Absolute time is common to us all, its extensions conjugate, so that whenever we think of the future, we conceive of it as a single determinate extension from the present along this uniform axis. However, imaginative time generates only collections of instances of remembrance. It is arbitrary and indeterminate. But, as Isozaki points out, we can get lost in this. Here, quote, facts are always being tampered with. Historical interpretation is something that must be constantly updated and revised. In terms of appreciating the ruin as a futurescape, this is important because, quote, ruins can be seen as fragments within the complex of absolute and imaginative time, forming definitive proof of past facts, facts broken and destroyed. We see them as once having formed part of completed, finished structures. Chance has conveyed them to us through the ravages of time. Extending imaginative time into the past generates such thoughts. Isozaki derived the idea of imaginative time from the ruins he was surrounded by during and after World War II. He connected these with the ruins of antiquity, describing how the materiality of the ruin catalyzed a shift in his vision and his understanding of temporality, which he then articulated to the ruins of antiquity. Isozaki writes, quote, despite the trauma, it seemed natural to associate the views of those burnt ruins with the ruins found in the West. The first structure that dominated my thinking in my work as an architect was that of the ruin. Isozaki argues, quote, ruins have hidden effects on us, stimulating fantasies, visions, and illusions. He goes on to state, architecture that includes ruins is not necessarily a special case. In fact, they lie within its general characteristic. Architecture is designed to withstand erosion and weathering. The suspension of time is an absolute condition. Nevertheless, even as weathering progresses, architecture remains a longing for indestructibility and eternity, as countless monuments stand testimony throughout history. Now, this is where we can operationalize this in terms of our present, our right now. Isozaki's ideas complement and extend the German language term Ruinenwert, ruin value, an idea Albert Speer drew upon to connect Nazi Germany's architecture with a Roman-inspired past and a haunting, intimidating future. But despite these precedents, which are harrowing in many regards, it's not all doom, death, and gloom. We can understand the ruin from both what we see in them, as well as what we imagine when we encounter them. In the ruin, the past and the future and the present all combine together. How can you not look at a place like Pompeii and ask, wow, what happened here? What's going to happen in the future? And how might that be affected by what's happening now? And again, this can all seem rather dark and foreboding if we only acknowledge certain aspects or self-evident characteristics of ruination and read them in a certain light or through certain historical lenses. But what I wish to emphasize is the importance of employing imaginative time to look backward from this very moment to appraise contemporary sites of ruination, not as harbingers of destruction and death, but as a material manifestation of possibilities and opportunities. We cannot consider sustainability, adaptive reuse, environmental impacts, spatial equity, ecological justice, and care for the earth and its inhabitants without imagining ruins and the transitions that the built environment goes through as time passes and places act out their processes. We have to ask the question, how will this look in 5, 10, 100, 1,000, or 10,000 years? That's what Isozaki has done with his own designs, working with his concept of imaginative time. This is a positive thing. I'm not talking about ruins to invoke an atavistic longing for what was, but on the contrary, I talk about them to highlight the future possibilities. What can be? I challenge the identification of certain buildings, structures, and facilities as important ruins of significance, with scare quotes, while others are undesirable masses that we simply need to demolish. I want to decenter totalized regulatory narratives about space and place. I argue many of the ruins of significance are more so exceptions to ruination than anything else. They're facsimiles of it. This is evident not only in their persistence, but in their ongoing curation, which is a process of active human maintenance that allows that persistence to continue. And that's the very antithesis of ruination. And I suggest we re-examine these places in a more holistic manner to address temporality as well as how we graft meaning onto these sites and locations as opposed to divining individualized perspective-dependent meanings from them. In the book Curated Decay, Heritage Beyond Saving, human geographer Caitlin DeSilva examines how various types of decay are managed. How we interface with ruination, with the natural processes of materials in the built environment aging and breaking down over time, is interesting when we look at the ruins of antiquity, especially the famous ones, because in many cases they're moderated to within an inch of their structural afterlives. They're maintained. In this frame, the Parthenon is not a ruin. It's a museum piece masquerading as one. De Silva says, quote, "It may be that in some circumstances a state of gradual decay provides more opportunities for memory making and more potential points of engagement and interpretation than the alternative." Following this, I argue possibilities and potentials are vital for comprehending the Gordian knot of ruins, for assessing what they are, what they were, and what they may yet become, which allows us to poke at and tease out how material structures are acted upon, venerated, or de-emphasized by both human and non-human parties and agents. If we think of it this way, we can also see the removal of things like unsightly debris from a ruined site as an act of adulteration, an act of narrowing it. Similarly, in his book Industrial Ruins, De Silva's contemporary Tim Edensor talks about the sensory expansion, which often accompanies the ruination of manufacturing sites and the like. The smells, the tactile phenomena, the visual stimuli, etc. Memory making in such a context, though quite possibly dangerous, is also more complex and, I argue, more indicative of life as it is actually lived. Nasty, brutish, and decaying. Yet I want to be clear. I don't consider historical preservation a bad thing. On the contrary, I love it, but we should consider the way grand, majestic ruins are framed and presented in the now, while balancing historical and cultural ideas which play into these overarching spatial narratives. Ruins shouldn't minimize or flatten how we understand and view the world. They should inspire us. This is why Isazaki's imaginative time concept is so important. It's a generative way by which to think about ruination and time, one that can provoke us to offer new thoughts about building, designing, making, being, and persisting, as well as desisting in the lived spaces we are lucky enough to experience. The risks of decontextualizing and elevating some aspects of space and place, while diminishing others, are important to consider. This involves accounting for how our body-subject experience, to use a term from Merleau-Ponty, switches up. When curated, the remains of the ruin are no longer natural processes in and of themselves. They're assisted natural processes. And there's a paradox at work which can flatten the complexity of material space when we engage in these acts of curation. The sentence, "this ruin has to be preserved, or it will decay," means that it's not really a ruin anymore. It is something else. A non-ruin, or an anti-ruin, perhaps. And in terms of the conference theme, I contend that by seeding us its ruins and structural remnants, antiquity has indeed done a lot for us. It's done something great for us. With these gifts, antiquity has provided us not only beautiful traces of fascinating pasts, but also with a set of cultural precedents which, when properly acknowledged and contextualized as part of an ever-evolving continuum that, following the nature of nature, will change and evolve over time, allows us to reassess our current built environment and grasp its future value, all at once. Your local abandoned gas station may well be tomorrow's Parthenon, or Roman Colosseum, or just a random abandoned gas station. But its ruination is not an incontrovertible descriptive status but a mutable state of ongoing and rich potentiality, a state of existence which reorganizes place and space, personal and public, and being and time, as well as not being and not time. And this is dependent upon perspective, which is part of the charm when it comes to seeing, witnessing, and feeling the ruin. What I wish to do with this discussion is encourage people to embrace a messy, contradictory, and complicated appreciation of classic ruins. Sites whose robustness has often been muted and which are sometimes more thoroughly maintained than many contemporary, relict, and functioning buildings. I'm doing this to explore how our ruined structural futures emerge with the passing of time, yet they can, and in my opinion must, be understood in the present, in the right now. The various ruins of antiquity, be they great or small, are useful for such reimaginings. We can use them to bridge high and low, important and trivial, here and there, and the in-between. And by looking at these places, structures, sites, locations, and spaces, we can understand that sure, ruins are not created equally, nor do they have equal levels of curation. But that's unimportant. It's their possibilities and their multimodal temporalities which are worth our time and concern. The back and forth matters. Ruins can be important, or they can be rubble, but above all, they are. And they have been, and they will be. And as somebody who subscribes to the thoughts of Isozaki, I argue they are all these things at once. Ruins act as temporal and cultural unifiers. They are roadmaps, gifts, and marvels, and we have antiquity to thank for many of them. Thank you.